The Triangle Game, the UK, France, and the United States. Great Britain's official response to the conflict, we were told, was predicated upon the fact that, as our former colonial master, she would not stand for the breakup of one of her prized colonies, especially one she had worked hard to develop. Michael Lippmann's report in The Independent in 1998 uncovers a far more cynical attitude. This paragraph confirmed what a number of us in Biafra already suspected about Harold Wilson's government. Cabinet papers for 1967, just released, show how the decision to continue arming Nigeria was not based on argument for or against secession or on the interest of its people, but on backing the likely winner. It is a case study in Realpolitik. As one Commonwealth Office briefing document to the Prime Minister put it, the sole immediate British interest is to bring the Nigerian economy back to a condition in which our substantial trade and investment can be further developed. The BBC's Rick Fountain is a story on Monday, January 3, 2000, called Secret Papers Reveal Biafra Intrigue, confirms that oil interest and competition between Britain, France, and the United States played a far more important role than the unified Nigerian position. At first, Biafra was successful, and this alarmed Britain, the former colonial power, anxious for its big oil holding. It also interested the Soviet Union, which saw a chance to increase its influence in West Africa. Both sent arms to boost the federal military government under General Yakubu Gowon. But France, the other big former colonial power in the region, also took a hand. Although Paris repeatedly denied arming the Biafrans, the newly released papers reveal intelligence reports showing that very large weapons shipments were reaching Biafra via two neighboring Francophone states, Ivory Coast and Gabon. The UK intelligence service warned that Soviet penetration was growing, but that these did not much trouble Paris. The British reports say the French objective appears to be the breakup of Nigeria, which threatens, by its size and potential, to overshadow France's client Francophone states in West Africa. I was aware from my contacts in England that many Britons were not pleased with the unsolicited leadership role Harold Wilson's government was playing in the bloody conflict in their former African colony. Emotional antipathy among the British public grew sufficiently as the conflict progressed to threaten the British Labour government's re-election chances. British journalists, writers, and intellectuals found the situation appalling as well. The Times of London complained that Britain's Nigerian policy is a failure. There is a serious loss of touch in the conduct of British foreign policy. Harold Wilson's government soon found itself awash in a public relations nightmare at home and abroad. Wilson personally accused the Duke of attempting to garner sympathy by exploiting the casualties of a war to which his government was supplying arms. The bombing of civilian targets in Biafra by the Nigerian Air Force made the evening news and appeared in the major newspapers in Great Britain and stirred a hornet's nest of outrage from the British people. Things were so tense that British dock workers reportedly refused to load ships with British arms heading for Lagos, protesting that they were being used to kill Biafran babies. By the time the Nigerian Air Force shot down a Swedish Red Cross plane carrying humanitarian supplies and medicines to the sick and dying in Biafra, killing all aboard, there was, understandably, an outbreak of public anguish in Britain. That distress grew even worse shortly after this, with the awful news that the International Red Cross director Dr. August Linz and his aides were detained for nearly 16 hours following their arrival in Lagos for a tour of humanitarian relief sites in Biafra and talks with Nigerian government officials. Across the English Channel, there was uplifting news. On July 31, 1968, Biafran diplomacy reached a milestone when the French Council of Ministers released a statement of approbation in support of Biafra, though it fell short of a full recognition of the secessionist republic. The government of France considers that the bloodshed and suffering endured for over a year by the population of Biafra demonstrates their will to assert themselves as a people. Faithful to its principles, the French government, therefore, considers that the present conflict should be solved on the basis of the right of peoples to self-determination and should include the setting in motion of appropriate international procedures. There was great excitement about this news in Biafra. Charles de Gaulle was a widely respected European leader who fought the Nazis valiantly during World War II from his base in Africa. I personally hoped that de Gaulle's extensive knowledge of the continent's history and political affairs would result in a sophisticated response to the crisis. I was encouraged when I heard that he was toying with the possibilities of an outright statement of recognition of the Republic of Biafra. Also buoyed by this news, the Biafran head of state, Ojukwu, sent emissaries to Paris to lobby for full French credence, which we all mistakenly assumed was in the bag, but also for de Gaulle to help persuade the United States government to support the Biafran cause. I discovered later that Jacques Fakat, described as the most powerful man in the Fifth Republic by eminent French journalist Pierre Pin, was the chief architect of French policy on the African continent. It was Fakat, I understand, who convinced the French Parliament and de Gaulle to respond forcefully to the humanitarian disaster in Biafra. De Gaulle needed little persuasion. It was well known that he bore a deep resentment of the British for what he saw as their unhelpful role in the French resistance, La Résistance Française, during World War II. Foucault, in his memoirs, informs us that Paris increased this Anglo-French rivalry by making aggressive diplomatic inroads into Ghana, a former British colony, which was surrounded by the former French colonies Benin, Togo, Burkina Faso, and Ivory Coast. Some Africanists believe that the Gaullists' objective seemed to be to neutralize Ghana and diminish Nigeria as a regional power and thereby contract Great Britain's sphere of influence in West Africa. There were other French interests that later came to light. Paris wanted the French oil company Elf Aquitaine, which had a smaller market share in Nigeria's oil industry, to have a greater footprint in the West African region consistent with Jacques Facat's vision of French dominance. Whatever French motivations might have been, we were grateful in Biafra to be receiving their support. The United States of America was officially neutral during the conflict, which meant that it overtly supported neither the Nigerians or the Biafrans. Those of us who wanted a more aggressive pro-Biafran stance from America, particularly on humanitarian grounds, were deeply disappointed, to put it mildly. Covertly, however, it was alleged that Washington under President Lyndon Johnson, before he left office in January 1968, was aiding the Nigerian war effort in cooperation with the British. His government also had a number of run-ins with Biafran Authority over the role of the International Red Cross, America's chief humanitarian organ, for getting relief to the needy in Biafra, particularly after Gowon and his government imposed a blockade. Several months into the conflict, however, the Nixon administration, initially towing the Johnson administration's line of neutral agreement in support of one Nigeria, took a more proactive role and called for the cessation of hostilities. It was the government of the much maligned Richard Nixon that raised concerns about Nigerian military strategy and levied the charges of ethnic cleansing and genocide against the Nigerian forces. Despite what some of us saw as a cynical disinterest on the part of the American government, The American people were characteristically generous and magnanimous in spirit. They sent millions of humanitarian dollars to ease the suffering of the innocent caught between the belligerents. The leaders of the African American civil rights community were understandably horrified by the breakdown in law and order in Nigeria. The black intelligentsia colleagues of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks were scholars of the nonviolent movement. On several occasions, they came out forcefully against all forms of ferocity during the Nigerian-Biafran conflict, reacting with dismay at the magnitude of the human suffering in Biafra. They sent numerous forms of communications both to Ojukwu and Gowon to put an end to the bloody civil war. They were particularly appalled by the widespread hunger and starvation of Biafrans and by the millions of stranded refugees, all of which they reiterated was unacceptable by civilized world opinion. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, was particularly critical of the brutality of the conflict. The leader of the influential civil rights group, Roy Wilkins, implored the Nigerians, especially to be more humane in their treatment of the Biafrans. He made a moral argument to end the food blockade by reminding Gowon that the need to save the lives of the thousands starving daily outweighed any military or political considerations. My admiration of the African American civil rights community was due not only to their moral positions on racial equality and the quest for peaceful coexistence of all peoples, but also on their arbitration during the Biafran struggle, an intervention that brought succor to millions and helped place a moral lens on the atrocities taking place in my homeland. The Soviet Union had no significant presence in the region prior to 1966, but progressively took greater interest in Nigerian affairs after the Agoe-Ironsi coup d'etat and the emergence of Nigeria as an important oil exporter. The initial neutrality of the USSR's Western rivals, including Britain and the United States in particular, I gather, provided an opening for the Soviets to send MiG fighters and technical assistance to the Nigerians, thereby including the region in the Cold War theater. There were other reasons for the ever-growing Soviet presence in Nigeria in 1969. The Soviets had announced their intention to expand their bilateral trade agreements with Nigeria to include military and economic assistance. They had their eyes on a truly large prize, a contract to build one of the largest steel mills in all of Africa at a cost of a then astonishing $120 million. That steel investment later became the Ajokuta Steel Mill in northern Nigeria, the poster child of corruption and white elephant project in Africa that went on to gulp over $4.6 billion of the Nigerian taxpayers' money, although very little steel was produced. The Portuguese, it should be made clear, had a more nebulous role with regard to Biafra. Portugal did not overtly back one side over the other during the conflict, which generated a great deal of talk and speculation. The extent of the Biafran relationship with Portugal was quite simply one that said, "We will support you quietly. Your planes can land in our territory, Sao Tome." Rajat Norji of Transition magazine probed to find out from me whether there was more to our relationship. My position at the time was understandably passionate. I am not interested in what motives Portugal may have. If the devil himself had offered his air facilities, we would have taken it, and I would have supported it. Portugal was very clever when it realized we were about to be exterminated and said, "You can land at our airport." And that's, as far as I know, is the extent of Biafran association with Portugal. Portugal has not given us any arms. We buy arms on the black market. The Chinese entered the contest late, albeit on the side of the Biafrans. Reports of Chinese technical and military assistance have been widely cited. Nevertheless, all told, the callous interference of the great powers led to greater despair and a prolongation of the tragedy.